Wine writers in Britain and in the US have been sniping at our wine exports lately too. There's also the threat of a continuing wine glut and the spectre of climate change affecting rainfall patterns, and that of course affects where the grapes grow. Just some of the conditions that long-time wine writer James Halliday considered when he put together the latest Australian Wine Companion, the 2010 edition. He's picked the eyes out of a tough 2009 vintage, and he's also given us his selections and predictions from the year ahead. So stay tuned if you want to know what's good drinking this year. And James Halliday's been busier than usual this year too, because he's also just released a new reference book for wine lovers. It's called the Australian Wine Encyclopedia. James joins us in our breakfast studio. James, welcome back to breakfast.
Thank you, Fran.
James Halliday, just how bad is it for winemakers at the moment? Because I remember the headlines just a little while ago that said that wine is cheaper than water, with $1.99 bottles of clean skins cheaper than bottled water. Is this just the wine glut continues?
Yes, it does. Surprisingly, for many of us, people have found, being Australian, when we face a problem, we find a way to fix it. And there's a lot of water trading that's been going on in the Murray-Darling and against expectations, and in fact against need, which is doubly unfortunate. We had another big vintage in 2009.
So why is it that winemakers don't adjust? I mean, we've been talking about glut for years now, people pouring out the wine down the sink. Why don't they adjust and make less wine?
Well, what else are they to do, the growers and the riverland? The federal government has given some an exit package, but then turns around and taxes the capital amount that they receive for departing the scene. And as I say, they are left with the question, well, what are we going to do with our lives? We stop growing grapes, what else can we do? And we can't swap to other orchards or whatever else on the Murray because that requires water. So they've really, in a sense, got nowhere to go. However, that said, you can't go on year after year either leaving the grapes on the vine or getting less than the cost of production.
Well, there has been talk of limiting the size of the annual crush, pulling some more vines out. Is that practical?
Yeah, well, except for
Inevitable?
the NIMBY factor. No, look, it shouldn't be me. It should be someone else that does this. Yes, we want it to happen, but no, we're not going to take our vines out. I mean, that's just human nature, and you've got to accept that. But the bigger forces, I think, are going to result inevitably in a downsizing. Then you think about the corporate world paradigm, and everyone agreeing that those who are laid off today, who are experienced, etc., when the conditions turn, rehiring the same people is very difficult, and it's going to be a very costly process. So if we take too many vines out of the ground, when conditions return, we won't have the wine to meet demand. To meet demand.
Well, it's all about demand, isn't it? I mean, in the past, the answer to the glut has been to try and get our marketing better, to export more globally. Is that an option still? Is there any more export room out there for us?
Well, the dramatic growth that has taken place since 1995, and it really has been dramatic, has all of that additional wine has gone to the export market, because we've come from absolutely nowhere in world stakes to the fourth largest exporter in the world. And
now we're copying it, though. I noticed that we've been getting some bad rap from the wine critics overseas.
Yes,
why?
Particularly in the UK. Well, I think it's familiarity breeding contempt. And they've really had not much else to really rave about. New Zealand's always been there. It's the darling of the UK. But it's very small production, or has been. Now there's a tsunami of Sauvignon Blanc, which is actually engulfing us in Australia too. And there's going to be a lot of hand wringing over that. There already is in New Zealand. So that they really haven't found another sort of Australia 20 years on.
Is that all it is, though, or can we be criticised for the quality of the wine we've been exporting? For a long time, people have been said we've devalued our brand by exporting the lower range of wine.
Yes, that's true, but it ignores the fact that 80%, 85%, or even 90% of the market is sold in supermarkets on store position and discount, and it's technically fine. It's the sort of wine that no one who's really interested in wine would consider buying, but it's it's the engine room. You've got to think of a pyramid, and it's only up the top that we've got our really good wines.
Let's go to this year's companion. There's a lot of wineries in it. There always is. I think there's 1,500 entries this time in this book. There's 148 new wineries emerged for this year's companion. People are still opening wineries, even though into the market we've just been describing, which is full of pitfalls.
Yes, and they're
Why?
They're a mix. They're either totally naive, they're wealthy, lawyers, doctors, bankers, you name it.
Chasing a dream.
Chasing a dream, exactly. The other group are grape growers who have been in the business for a long time, and happens quite a lot on the Barossa. Faced with falling prices for their grapes, have said, okay, we know how good these are. We know they've gone into Grange or whatever in the past. Therefore, we'll get wine made for us. They've got a very low capital cost because they use contract wineries. They're what I call virtual. Well, no, they're not what virtual wineries because they do have vineyards. So they're the two sort of big categories there.
And is it working? The grape growers you just described, they're doing that. Are they producing some decent wines?
Yes, they are producing, well, particularly those who are coming off the back of vineyards which may be 100 years or more old, or certainly more than 20 years old. They just haven't recently gone in the ground on the basis of Hail Mary. They're real grape growers.
It's 8:24 on Breakfast. James Halliday is our guest. We're talking wine, as you always do when you sit down with James Halliday. James, I can't even imagine how many wines you must have tasted. You must taste every year to come up with a book like this. It's
an awful lot. I mean, there are 5,884 tasting notes in this book, but this year there's another 2,500, 3,000 that just went straight to the website because they didn't reach the points required to get into this book.
I can't do the sums, James. How many bottles of wine does that mean, or a glass of wine you taste a day on some days?
Oh, well, it's my standard tasting day is 150 wines. I said to someone that there are 5,884 tasting notes in this book. That means, in fact, that I spat out 5,883 wines. And, well, what was the single wine that you didn't necessarily spit out? And the answer to that is the highest pointed wine in the book, which is 2004 Grange, which I think is a very great Grange. So it's a bit of, I guess, history repeating itself, but it hasn't always streeted the field like when it's a young wine, as the 2004 has.
Okay, before you leave us today, I'm going to get you to give us perhaps a couple of different wines we might not necessarily know to pick off the shelves after your research this year. But let's talk about your new encyclopedia for a moment, the Australian Wine Encyclopedia. It covers everything from personalities in the wine industry over the years to various major wineries to the different classes of wine. Why do we need this, James?
Well, no one had done it. I did actually get a copy of a book written about Californian wine, which I thought was pretty neat. It looks at the history on an A to Z basis. It virtually covers the field, as it were. And I really thought that's a pretty neat book.
Unusually including the personalities in this.
Yeah, well, I like history, you see, and most of the personalities are past, not all of them, some are present. And in one sense, it's a distillation of 40 years in the wine game. But other than that, importantly, I've written it so that on a relaxed basis, it's not the normal language that you see in an encyclopedia. It's much more open and, I hope, accessible.
And look, we're almost out of time, but is there any one story you came across as you researched this that sticks out for you, that really thrilled you? Something you didn't know, heavens above?
Ooh, now, there you've thrown me. Now, there was, yes, I know. It actually didn't come out of the encyclopedia, but I learned it only the other day, old dog. In Coonawarra, because it's so flat, you think the only differentiating feature is the soil. In fact, as you go from south to north, for every kilometre, you get 1 day earlier in grape ripening. It's a real climatic progression in Coonawarra.
You learn something new every day, and Coonawarra is there in the encyclopedia, under C, of course. Before you go, give us 1, 2, 3 wines we should be looking at this year.
Okay, Mornington Peninsula is doing really well with Pinot Noir, and my top Pinot was Tux Ridge from the Mornington Peninsula. There's a pretty good field of wines there. Grange we've already discussed. Many people love Clonakilla. It's Shiraz Viognier from Canberra, and from the Barossa Spinifex, which is not your normal Barossa red wine.
James Halliday, it's great to speak to you again. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
James Halliday and his Australian Wine Companion 2010 is out, as is his new book, the Australian Wine Encyclopedia, both published by Hardy Grant Books, and as I said, available now.